Now we want to turn to a true friend of the libraries. Tonight's special guest, Garrison Keillor, is a graduate of the University of Minnesota. He's a writer of books and essays and radio scripts, comedy sketches, sonnets, limericks, cowboy songs, and political commentary. He sings, he channels memorable characters, and takes us back to an extraordinarily familiar hometown, which, like his friends gathered here this evening, boasts a citizenry that is always above average, right? He's given us a generation of wonderfully drawn characters, from Ruth Harrison, the reference librarian, to Guy Noir, Private Eye. And Prairie Home Companion is the only nationwide live music and variety show and is heard by more than 4 million U.S. listeners each week and some 590 public radio stations and abroad on America One and the Armed Forces Network in Europe and in the Far East. That's an amazing accomplishment and an extraordinary body of work if you think about it. He's been a good friend of the libraries and a supporter. In 1993, he was featured at the very first Friends of the Library event, and upon that occasion, he said, "The University of Minnesota is one of the glories of our state, and I trust you know, but I wonder if you know of the importance of the glorious library. It's a momentous excellence in our state. This quiet institution has no end of patrons." We're not all that quiet anymore, by the way. "And as an old patron who has spent countless hours in the reading room and the stacks, I have happily agreed to be one friend, and I hope you will join to be another." And then later, on our 10th anniversary of the Friends group, he joined us again for what was billed as an evening of ribald literature, and I'm sure those of us who were there remember it well. Quite an evening. And so tonight, we get a chance with appreciation and anticipation, really, to welcome Garrison Keillor to our stage again for a third time. So please join me in welcoming Garrison Keillor.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Thank you so much. What a much too generous introduction. I could edit that, but I won't take up your time. I'm a little bit bitter that I was not invited to give the Pancake Poetry Series reading in April. I was beaten out by Louis Jenkins, even though he writes prose poems, which in the prose business we call paragraphs. I write poems that rhyme and that have a meter. In fact, I wrote one. I should start with it. I'm a radio man for 35 years, doing an old variety show based on some I used to hear when I was your age, long ago. Critics pointed out my debts to Bob and Ray and Fibber McGee, but alcohol and cigarettes swept those critics out to sea. And to 20-year-olds who were born too late to hear the great Fred Allen, I'm the inventor of the form, sailing the airwaves like Magellan. A thief who escapes and is not hung may yet be honored by the young. Plagiarism. It is spring here on the frozen tundra, and as always, it is late, and as always, we are thrilled by it, although being Midwesterners, we are able to conceal this very well and keep it to ourselves. We are a famously well-behaved, self-repressed people. And most of us believe that that's a good thing, especially in the library. I am a high decorum person. I believed in good decorum ever since I first walked into a library. It was no more than what was expected of us. We have seen neighborhoods that were more celebratory than neighborhoods hereabouts, Greenwich Village and the French Quarter and the Castro in San Francisco and parts of Berkeley, and we're glad not to live there. We know how to be appropriate, we in the Midwest, and we try to be. And when we're tired of being inappropriate, we're happy to go elsewhere, to Greenwich Village, to the Castro, West Hollywood, New Orleans, Las Vegas, and be inappropriate there among other people, and then return. I live in St. Paul, which is a very high decorum city just to the east of here, the city for which the GPS was invented. And we observe a very high standard of decorum. There is no hip young neighborhood in St. Paul. We made sure of it. Minneapolis has 3 or 4 of them, and they are welcome to them. On May Day morning, when it snowed, in St. Paul at least, I don't know about Minneapolis, you saw Midwestern fortitude at its best. In my house, at least, and among all of the people I talked to that day, there was never a mention of snow. It fell without anybody commenting on it. People probably looked up to the sky and they thought what they wanted to think and said what they wanted to say to God Almighty, and to remind him that it was May. But nobody said anything about it. And then the other morning when we got that beautiful, beautiful thunderstorm and you felt the electricity in the air, it was so unspeakably thrilling. You could see it in the people around you. You could see the undead coming to life. You could see ambition reignited in people who'd been logy for 6 months. You could see plant stores suddenly got busy, and you could see mating behaviors in coffee shops, and high school kids necking in back seats of cars in broad daylight in parking lots, and the birds going crazy, and dogs humping your leg, and all of these things. The miracle of spring, and it's especially powerful and miraculous to people who were here in January and February, and in March, the month that God designed to show people who don't drink what a hangover is like. The snowbirds who returned around May Day, just in time to miss that snowfall, and who arrived back in town all tanned and happy and perky, and who were joking about maybe we shouldn't put our snow shovels away. These people who told us about the wonderful winter that they had in Tucson, these are people who we would rather not know. I hope they know this. Of course, we would never tell them, but I'm going to be avoiding my friends of that sort for a while to come. There are many man-made miracles, but none of them really compare to spring, which comes every year, more or less on time. There is the great miracle of non-fat half and half, which I just can't get my mind around. There's the cheapness of long-distance phone calls compared to when I was a boy and when it was saved for emergencies. And the Oxford English Dictionary continues to amaze. And this morning I stood in the shower and I washed my hair with a shampoo that contained cucumbers, which is so new for me. We raised them in our garden when I was a boy, and we used them to make pickles. But we never thought of putting them in our hair somehow. It just never, ever occurred to us. But the advent of spring, which enlivens us, even Minnesotans, when at last you can walk barefoot out into the world and sit under a tree and drink your coffee, and you can tear yourself away from your computer screen, and you can walk briskly in your neighborhood, and you can see who else lives here other than yourself. This is the true miracle. This is part of what makes life worthwhile. My Uncle Jim was a farmer up north of Anoka. He died of heart arrhythmia in 1970. And I remember when he died and the funeral procession left Anoka and drove north toward the cemetery on Highway 47, I looked back and couldn't believe the line of cars for my Uncle Jim, who was a farmer and then was a cook in a cafeteria. It was almost a mile long. It was an enormous crowd that gathered in this tiny cemetery out where my people have settled back around 1880. And I asked my other uncle why this long procession for a man I didn't think of as famous. And my uncle said, because Jim talked to everybody. When he went to town, there wasn't anybody that he wouldn't talk to. And that's what civility means, is the willingness to approach anybody and everybody and to find something that you have in common with them and to make the most of it. In my business, which is the business there is no business like, you start out targeted towards your audience, some niche, the disaffected urban youth or dairy farmers or people like yourself. And you try to interest and engage and amuse people who are sort of like yourself. But if you stick around in the business, you will find yourself more and more facing audiences that are not your audience. And that is a civilizing influence on a person, to try to give a good time to people you don't understand and who may not particularly like you. I once, as a favor to my cousin, who was in the tire business in Anoka, flew to Las Vegas late one night to speak at a breakfast meeting of the American Tire Dealers Association, which is not a public radio crowd. It was 7 o'clock in the morning, and I was trying to amuse burly men who had hangovers. And that's when you give up talking about yourself, and you just tell jokes. That's all they really want. I'm proud of my performance that morning in Las Vegas, for which I was not paid. I don't take money from relatives. We work on a barter system. But it was a very civil morning. The willingness to meet anybody halfway, to look everyone in the eye, to engage, to connect, is the basis of civilization. And it's an attribute that is ever in danger in our culture, which is a culture enamored of the automobile. Riding around in a steel box can turn a person into sociopath. And you see this over and over. especially during rush hour. You see intense rage that people would never express if they were face to face with someone. When I was in New York, riding around in Manhattan, where having your own car would be sort of like having a hump, I was impressed by the pedestrian culture. Although as a Midwesterner, you feel vulnerable at first. You get on the subway, and all of these young men, all of these young black men, it worries you. And then you realize that these young men, all of these people, are part of a pedestrian culture. And there is a prevailing civility here in this city. And people are careful what they say and what they do when they are in proximity to other people. Rush Limbaugh is a guy in a locked studio who was talking to other guys in Lincoln Town Cars. And he might be a very different man on public transportation. Civility is the essence of the public library, and there's really no place on earth that is quite like it. I first realized this when I was 10 years old, and I rode my Schwinn bicycle, one gear, from Brooklyn Park, north of Minneapolis, on the Mississippi, when Brooklyn Park was a village of truck farms and cornfields, and rode my bicycle down Highway 169, up Washington Avenue, past the printing plants, past the barrel factory, all the way to Hennepin Avenue, and turned right, past the bars, past the Penny Arcade, past the gay 90s, the strip clubs, past doorways with men sunk in them, drinking something out of paper bags, all the way up to the Minneapolis Library and its great stone castle up on 10th and Hennepin. Parked my bike against the building without a bicycle lock, walked inside, through the periodicals room, up the stairs, past the Egyptian mummy, past the facsimile of the Declaration of Independence, to the children's room on the 4th floor, walked in, and here was a table strewn with new books that anybody could pick up and look at. I've never gotten over that experience. For me, the Kindle has no real meaning somehow. It's the smell of ink on paper that I find intoxicating. And then I open the book and maybe I'm intoxicated and maybe not. The library is also a quiet space in our world. I hope it is. I hope we don't. I hope that we don't accept that people act out in libraries. It's a quiet place, and we need that in this world. Everybody's very, very busy. I walk into a coffee shop, and it's full of young people, and they're very expensive laptops. I don't know how they afford them, but there they are, and they're drinking $4 coffee, and they're and they're going. They've got little buds in their ears, and they're listening to something, and they're texting with one hand and just one thumb on a small keypad. They're sending off texts, and they're at their laptops, and they're clicking and dragging, and they're updating their Facebook page so that the world will know from hour to hour what they're doing, what they're thinking, what they're feeling. These are people of the Montessori generation who were brought up to assume that we are interested in them. I am of an older generation. I had the benefit of child neglect, and we were raised up to a certain height to where we could reach a doorknob, and then we were ushered out. Go, darling, go outdoors. Don't come back too soon. And so we ran loose in the streets like coyotes. We ran in packs, and you had to learn how to deal with people your age, people 10, 11, 12 years old, who then as now were some of the meanest people in the world. You had to learn the art of cowardice or learn how to amuse people who otherwise might have beaten you up. But I go into a coffee shop, and the data that is flowing through here is just utterly astonishing. And then sitting in my neighborhood coffee shop a week ago and listening to a guy who was doing all of this and also was clicking on YouTube videos of animals doing stupid things and cats walking into glass doors and the sex lives of gerbils. I don't know all what he was doing. I was listening to him. He was on the phone, and he was talking about a party that he had been to and what a disappointment it was because she wasn't interested in anymore. And he had assumed that she would be, but she wasn't. And she gave him the cold shoulder, and that's why he drank 8 bottles of beer, and he had some bourbon, and also he had some vodka. He thinks it was vodka, and he smoked some dope, and he was wrecked for 3 or 4 days afterward. And then he said, "I've got to run, Mom," and this is a generation that is intensely busy, and it needs a sanctuary, and the library can be that sanctuary. It can be a workspace where busy people who, when they need to cut out distractions and do what they said they wanted to do and finish that screenplay, write that paper, do that story, can go and get focused, pull themselves together. This is the role of the library, long after the book itself may become a province for the older reader. If you want to do something, you have to bend your will to it and not be distracted by online solitaire and YouTube videos. It may help you to sit in the reading room surrounded by other studious and industrious people under the eyes of librarians who enforce the sort of decorum that gives each person in the room the freedom of his or her own mind. The library is also a vending machine for books, all the books that people want to read, and the books about crises, books about World War II air raids, Battle of Britain, thrillers, sirens going off, and all of the books that the sirens went off as I was standing at the lectern. I ducked down and I opened up my wrist radio. I called into headquarters. Headquarters said, forget about it, forget about it. It's nothing. Just continue. Go on with your speech. I said, how can I do that? It's getting louder. It's getting louder. I said, that happens all the time. There's a gavel there by your right hand. Just hit the gavel and everything will quiet down.
So we have a tornado warning?
Is that it?
And we have to go to the basement?
Do we really? Oh, bless my heart. How exciting. Let's move then as directed, and let's move in a quiet, courteous way, talking among yourselves so as to keep the level of panic low. I see people walking very slowly down the street outside our building who may not be aware of a tornado warning. They may be the ones who set off the alarm. Madam Director, shall we take a vote? Minnesota, hail to thee. Hail to thee, our college dear. Thy name shall ever be a beacon bright and clear. Thy sons and daughters true will proclaim thee near and far. They will guard thy name and adore thy name. Thou shalt be their northern star. Like the stream that bends to sea, like the pine that seeks the blue, Minnesota, still for thee, our hearts beat ever true. From the fields and prairies wide to the forest standing near, to thy name we talk, we will gladly flock. Minnesota, hail to thee. Minnesota, hats off to thee. To our colors true we shall ever be. Firm and strong, united are we. Rah, rah, rah for Ski-U-Mah. Rah, 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 rah for the U of N. M-I-N-N-E-S-O-T-A. Minnesota. Minnesota. Yeah. Is everyone up out of the cellar? Oh, the line. Oh, they're still coming. People are still coming. Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountains' majesty above the fruited plain. America, America, God shed his grace on thee. and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. Oh, beautiful for pilgrims' feet whose stern impassioned stress a thoroughfare for freedom be. All right, we're all safe. We're all good. We're going to move on now quickly to the. I will add my remarks to the record, and I so move. All in favor? Aye. Thank you. And I'll give that speech another time. Thank you very much. Are there any questions from this fine audience? Any questions about tornadoes? Any question about why the Anoka High School teams, their nicknames are the Tornadoes? Any questions about WCCO and storm warnings? What it was like in the old days? No, I'm not worried about Lake Wobegon at all. It's
Garrison, Steve Benson. Garrison, did we see you in good Minnesota fashion go to the door and look outside before you headed for the cellar?
This is what all Minnesota men do, Mr. Benson. Minnesota men, when they are, when the radio says no unnecessary driving, we immediately get into our cars and we head for town. And when there is a storm warning, we go outside and watch it. I didn't see you out there, Steve. Any other questions, or does that cover it? Take your time. Yes. Oh, here's a question down front from a fellow artist.
I am Maria Jetty from Esterville, Iowa.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to know, in your student days, what areas of the university libraries did you most frequent?
What areas of the university library did I most frequent when I was a student here? I was a student here in ancient times, and so Wilson Library did not exist. Wilson Library was just a series of small frame houses occupied by immigrant Swedes. And I'm sorry? A question? No. I frequented Walter Library, and this was in the days when smoking was everywhere, and so I sat in the basement of Walter, and we used small tuna fish cans for ashtrays. They were painted a dark gray and black. So I sat down there and I chain smoked unfiltered cigarettes to prove that I was an intellectual, and I read books, and it was wonderful. There was a long reading room on the first floor of Walter, but Walter had the sort of magnificence that you want a library to have. It had those marble staircases and great balustrades and brass work and so on. The people who most need a library are people who have no money whatsoever, which is the case with most people starting out to be writers. And so to be surrounded by opulence gives some dignity to what you're doing. I loved Walter for that reason. And when Wilson came along, I went over there, but it was just a big warehouse. It didn't have the class that Walter Library had. In a moment, I'll start asking myself questions. Yes.
I just wanted to ask if you've seen Walter Library in the last couple of years after they rehabbed it. It's gorgeous again.
It is, really?
Yes, it really is. It's worth a visit. They did a great job in the opulence direction.
Good. They had had a reading room with a sort of an ornate, sort of gold leaf ceiling.
They recovered that. It looks gorgeous. It's worth a visit.
They covered it?
They recovered it.
Oh,
they uncovered it.
Uncovered it.
They made it great again. It really is worth a visit.
Good. Well, then I will. I love those ornate reading rooms, and there aren't as many of them as there should be. The one in New York, the New York Public Library, those great reading rooms up on the third floor, I guess. You go up those long marble stairs that are like something out of Tsarist Russia, from the Tsar's Winter Palace, and you go up there to those long tables, long oak tables, and the long library lamps. I sort of recall Walter in the same way, those library lamps with the green glass shades, and you sit there in utter silence. You hear pages turning, and this was before laptop computers, so you didn't have that little clickety click. You had the sound of pencil lead on paper, and the sound of pages turning. It was remarkable to somebody who wanted to be a writer, and who at the same time as he wanted to be a writer, talking about myself, also felt that it was sort of a hopeless enterprise. I was in the 8th grade in Anoka High School when my English teacher, Frayne Anderson, gave me a copy of the New Yorker magazine and said, "Here, I think you would be interested in this." It's a copy I still have, and it's a copy of the magazine with John Cheever and S.J. Perlman and A.J. Liebling all in one issue. The cover price is, I think, 75 cents. And I read this magazine over and over 50 times, but it seemed so remote, the idea of writing for the New Yorker. But when you go into a library and you're surrounded by this grandeur, it really boosts your morale. I really believe in the grandeur of libraries. I'm the only one left who does, but I still do. I think they're supposed to be fabulous, expensive places.
Bob Thayer from St. Paul.
Yes, sir.
There's another reason why I hope that printed volumes never go away, and that is book mold. I guess that there are spores given off by book mold that are a mild hallucinogen. And when we informed my straight-laced mother, who was also a librarian, about this fact, she was quite chagrined to learn that all these years she'd been feeling great in the library and inhaling all the book mold spores.
Good. Glad to hear it.
Mr. Keillor, my name's Tom Fisher. I'm a great fan of your Writer's Almanac. Could you talk a little bit about the process of putting that together, and a little bit about your own writing process? How are you so productive?
How am I so
productive,
productive
as a writer?
Oh, I don't feel productive. I feel that I'm a slow writer, and I'm a recalcitrant writer. But I do get up every morning, and the earlier the better. I got up at 2 o'clock in the morning on Monday, and I just felt so lucky to rise up out of your dreams after 3 hours and go downstairs in the great silence of early morning and sit with a pen against a legal pad and write. I've been doing this since I was a child, and it's the one steady thing in my life is putting a pen against a piece of paper and feeling the line. I've been doing it seriously since I was 13 or 14, and I wanted to go out for football at Anoka High School, and I went down to the Mork Clinic, and Dr. Mork listened to my heart and heard this little click of a mitral valve prolapse, and so he wouldn't sign the slip to let me play football, which was disappointing. But if you lose out on one opportunity to impress girls, there are always other things you can do. And so I chose that, and out of that missed opportunity to become a mediocre football player, I went on to become a mediocre writer, and I've been doing it since I was a kid. The Writer's Almanac is it's an odd little public radio show. It's 5 minutes in length, which is odd in itself, and it's a few historical elements, and then a poem. I choose the poem so that it can be grasped by a listener on first hearing who is doing other things and who is frying up eggs and yelling at children and hustling to get somewhere. And that goes against my upbringing as an English major, which taught me to value opaque poems that needed me to explicate them. But for the Writer's Almanac, I choose poems that are very clear statements and no blowing smoke, just the straight thing, as straight as the poet can afford to be.
We have a question over here.
Yes.
Oh, hi, Garrison. It's Marianne Moriella, Wobegon woman.
Is there what?
A Wobegon woman. Would you share, or could you share, a latest inspirational poem that you really delighted in writing?
A poem of mine?
Yes.
You're asking me to recite a poem of my own?
I am, or start and make it up now would be wonderful.
Oh, bless your heart. Bless your heart. Well, should it be a G-rated poem, or what are we looking for?
I'll take any offering.
Well, I've written a whole batch of sonnets, love sonnets. Some of them are, and then some of them are even more so. And those are the only. Let me see. What would my eyes get misty when I think of Julie Christie? If a man wished to be kissed, he would want it to be her lips. I love you truly, my darling Julie. You'd make a king a fool, he would launch 1,000 ships. And today you are turning 66. Time is still playing its cruel little tricks. I still see you walking through the snow, looking for your lover, Dr. Zhivago, in the bad old days of long ago, as the Tsar and Tsarina and the bourgeois go off to the Gulag archipelago. Let's go to a hotel in Chicago. I wrote that for Julie Christie's 66th birthday, and I recited it on a Prairie Home Companion. And a week or so later, I got a note from Julie Christie. Very beautiful penmanship for someone in theater, and a very elegant letter thanking me for my love.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Yes, of course.
Tough to follow that poem. But I have a question about your traveling, and you go all over the country with Prairie Home Companion. And are there audiences that are more receptive? I mean, are there areas where there are better readers and better receptors of Prairie Home Companion than others?
Well, we charge people a lot of money to come see the show. And so that kind of weeds out the tepid. I learned that a long time ago. The very first show that we did was at McAllister in July the 6th, 1974. And tickets were $1. I am a Democrat, and so, that was sort of on democratic principles that you should charge the lowest price you possibly can to give more people a chance to come. This is all wrong. If you charge people $75, they'll really want to be there, and they'll have high expectations. And you, backstage, thinking about the fact that people paid $75 to be there, will feel tremendous guilt and shame. How could you possibly charge people that much to come and see you from Anoka, Minnesota? And this shame is what pushes you to do a better show than you might otherwise do. Audiences in New York are especially good because they not only pay a high ticket price, but they also have endured hours of trying to get to New York. And they come in from Westchester, and they have to take the Metro North, and they have to park their cars, they have to deal with traffic, they have to go over toll bridges and so forth. And when they come into the town hall on West 43rd Street, they're just so grateful to have a place to sit down, a place with a toilet where they can sit down and relax. And they're great. They're a great audience. Was that your question?
Where else? There are good audiences.
A good audience. Los Angeles, not a good audience because they're all actors, or they're in the business, or they want to be in the business, and people in the business are the worst audience. They're studying you. You can see them looking at you through narrowed eyes, and they're thinking, I could do that. I could do that a lot better than that. And Midwestern audiences are cautious. A Midwestern audience is made up of people who do not want to be the only person laughing. And so they wait to make sure other people around them are laughing before they do. They don't want to laugh at a joke which is in poor taste or which is sexist. And so they wait to make sure they hear women laughing. And so this can be kind of a slow audience. You say something that you had thought was funny, and then you wait for a while. And so it's a little nerve-wracking. And also with a Midwestern audience, there's always the fear that relatives are there. And of course, that's the most difficult audience of all. Any audience where you know your mother is there is going to be tough. People have almost canceled a show because they knew that their parents were in the audience. One excellent reason for moving to New York. All right?
Final question.
Is that good?
I just wondered, what was your favorite story as a child, and what now is your favorite poem?
Well, most of the stories that I heard as a child were stories from the Bible. And I can't say that they were my favorites because the stories that were told to us and emphasized were rather frightening stories. The story of Abraham and Isaac, and Abraham leading his son up to the top of the mountain with a knife. And Abraham was a man of God, and if God had told him to cut the boy's throat and offer him up as a sacrifice, Scripture makes clear that he would have done this. My father was a godly man. We had knives in the house. We didn't have mountains because it was Minnesota, but, it just meant you would have gotten there quicker. And how would he know if it was God telling him or some other voice? How would he know? This was a spooky story. My favorite stories as a kid were stories of disaster. Story of fires. There were 2 house fires in our family, and there were people who still remembered them, and they told them over and over and over again. Tonight's little episode could become a story. You'd have to fix it, There would have to be breakage of glass, you'd have to add that. You'd have to, have a sound like a train approaching. That's what a tornado is supposed to sound like. And all the air being sucked out and people screaming and you remaining calm. And that could be a good story if you run into people who, don't live in Minnesota. If you call people down in Arizona later tonight, you could tell that. They would love to hear it, actually, Any stories about weather in Minnesota are very popular, down south especially. My favorite stories as a grown-up are stories of the moral confusion of my friends, and people later in the evening when the lights are dim and we're sitting out on the porch and they lean forward and they tell you about something that happened that they've never told anybody else. I like exclusivity with a story. And I've used some of these on a Prairie Home Companion, artfully disguised. And as a result, I have very few friends left. And my favorite poem, well, okay. I'll close. May I close on this? Shall I close on this? My favorite poem was a poem that my Uncle Jim knew by heart, whom I mentioned earlier, the man with the long funeral cortege in Anoka. He, as most of the people in my family, he loved morbid poems. And poems, lighthearted poems, just didn't make sense to people in that family. Somebody said that it couldn't be done, but he with a smile replied that maybe it couldn't, but he would be one who wouldn't say so till he tried, that sort of a poem. So he buckled right in with a bit of a grin and so forth. Zippity-doo-dah, zippity-a didn't make any sense to those people. They were hard workers. But he once took me fishing my uncle, very early in the morning on Lake George up near Anoka. And we sat in a boat as the sun was coming up, and he recited a poem to me that I've known for years. 'Twas many and many a year ago in a kingdom by the sea that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. She was a child, and I was a child in the kingdom by the sea, but we loved with a love that was more than love, I and my Annabel Lee, a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted her and me. And that was the reason, as all men know in the kingdom by the sea, that a wind came out of a cloud, killing and chilling my Annabel Lee, so that her high-born kinsman came and bore her away from me and shut her up in a sepulchre, in a tomb by the sounding sea. But neither the angels in heaven above nor the demons down under the sea can ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee, and the stars never rise, but I see the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee. So all the night tide I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, in her tomb by the sounding sea, in her sepulchre by the sea. But not yet. We escaped tonight, you and I. Not yet. Thank you so much.